Ryan and I are here with a preview of Aces and Armor from PKB Games. I'm going to tell you right now, this is not the typical kind of game that we cover on the channel. We don't do a lot of war games, but this one jumped out at me. When they sent me the email, it reminded me of some old video games I played because it's kind of a streamlined experience for sure in terms of war games.
Yeah.
But it still has enough detail to make it somewhat satisfying, I think.
Yeah, I think I'm fair to say that neither David nor I are really heavy into the war game genre. And there's a lot of things about that genre I think that turn me off. There's a lot of bookkeeping. There's usually a ton of things you have to consider. Detailed little movements and sometimes even like fuel and supply lines. This game is not that type of game.
No.
This game is designed for somebody that wants to enjoy a war game that is more on the entry level, something that you can read the rules and almost jump right into and start playing.
Yeah, I would say it's a streamlined experience, and it reminded me of an old video game called Military Madness. It's hex-based, and a lot of the rules are very similar. Of course, you're going to see a lot of that with a lot of different war games, but like we've said, this is a streamlined experience. It does have enough meat, though, to make it a little bit more interesting, and it was fairly satisfying to play. We've got it set up here. You're going to see all the things that you might expect to see. This is one of two sides of the map. We are playing in a two-player game just on the upper side of this map. In a four-player game, you're going to have an ally, and it's going to be 2v2. You can actually also play 2 versus an automa in a cooperative mode as well. So they've got a lot of different modes. But you're going to start by getting these location tiles and flipping them over after assigning your units to them, and then placing your units out on those spaces. Those spaces, as you can see, are some distance away from these factories that are spread all across the board, the goal being to capture those factories. In a longer game, you can capture 4 of those to win. In a shorter game, which is what we played, you're going to capture 3 of those factories to win the game. But that is how you win the game.
Yeah, the game is easy to play in the fact that you're just kind of moving your units, resolving attacks, and then doing a little bit of an upkeep phase where you're going to be gaining income for the different factories that you've taken over. So that kind of feels like what you'd expect from a military game. You're fighting over these factories, they produce income, they allow you to build more units, they allow you to repair units, so you're going to kind of be expanding your armor. So that part is pretty easy, but where the actual depth of the game comes in is this sheet right here. And before we go any further, I want to say everything on this sheet is kind of in flux. They're balancing the game as it goes. They've even been sending us some updated information. So if these numbers aren't right, I can guarantee you they won't be final.
These numbers right here aren't right because, like Ryan said, they are continuing to balance this thing. They've tweaked rules even since we've gotten the prototype. So it just goes to show you that they continue to work on it. But like Ryan said, it's a very streamlined experience. In fact, they have some rules for a two-player game where one player is not going to get a big head start. You're not going to move all of your units. That's the only sort of tweak to the rules. In the first round and a half or two, the first player is going to move one of their armies, which is effectively a group of their units on one of those locations. Then the next player moves 2, and then the other guy goes back to finishing their 2. Yeah. And then once you get to the second round or so, each player, when they move their units, are going to move all the units on their board. They're going to resolve all of the phases of a turn. In fact, they're going to move all their units, they're going to declare their attacks, they're going to resolve the combat, and like Ryan said, then they're going to do that upkeep where they get money from factories, maybe repair some of their units.
Yeah, and all of that information, again, is on that sheet. It's going to tell you how many spaces you get to move. It's going to tell you the cost to build new versions of these units. It's going to tell you how much damage they can do when you're rolling dice in combat, and how much damage they can take as far as when your opponent rolls, you're going to be taking a certain amount of damage, which we'll explain in a second because we've kind of set up a combat here because the goal, obviously, of this game is very PvP oriented. And there's kind of 2 ways combat can happen. Either as you're moving, you're positioning your units in such a way that they're going to end up within range of the opponent, which again is on that sheet. Or as you're moving around the board, if you pass through an enemy unit's range, they can actually choose to stop you and start attacking you and firing on you as you move past them. But however it happens, the combat phase is probably the meatiest part of the game.
Yeah, I mean, resolving combat is a significant part of the game. While you're moving, though, there is something to point out. It is not so streamlined that it doesn't take into consideration the various types of terrain. Yeah. There are different types of terrain, and you're going to be able to move faster on roads. You're going to move slower on a lot of other terrains. And in fact, when you move into a factory with an infantry unit, you actually have to use your entire move action, no matter how many movement points you have. one of your infantry units, and you've got an infantry and a mobile infantry unit, can move into a factory using all of its moves. That's the only way to overtake that factory. You're going to put one of your tokens on the factory, showing that you have control of it. Then that is the kind of factory, the ones that you have control over, that can come into play during that last phase.
Yeah, and that's all done during the movement phase, because that whole point of that section or that whole phase is to position your units. Because once you move on to the combat phase, positioning is going to matter. And that's where, again, this little player aid comes in as well. When you're attacking, you're going to be rolling a number of dice, and it's a lot. At full health, you're rolling 12. And you'll notice here, as you take damage, it actually shows you, you'll start rolling less dice. But if you look at the next section, it actually shows you how positioning matters, because you could be rolling more than 12. You can be earning these red dice. So for this example combat, if we were going to fight this battle right now, my tank is at full health. It will roll all 12 of these dice. And then this plane here, as it shows on my sheet, will give me 1 bonus red die, and you can earn up to 3 possible bonus red dice. So I would, as the tank attacking, roll all of these dice. And yes, it's a lot of numbers, but they're not all going to hit. In fact, you don't even want to roll high. It's actually, you want to roll low. You want to roll under a specific number that, again, is printed on this sheet.
Plus, the defender, if they're able to attack back, that's something you're going to determine too. So if Ryan says, I'm attacking with the tank, and we're resolving that, he'd get his dice, then we determine, okay, can my guy attack the tank back? In this case, I can. So I'm going to be rolling all my dice too, because I have no damage. I'd roll all those. So the combat is going to reflect damage potentially going both ways.
Yeah.
Now, the different units have different values. The damage that you have on the unit is always going to dictate how many dice you roll to begin with, plus those potential extra ones. But there are some cool features as you play the game. You're going to look at these units. You probably can't see this very well, so I'll put up a picture. There's these 2 little rods attached to each unit. You're going to stack on one of those the damage. It's going to hold up to 5 pieces. On the 6th one, it's destroyed. But the other rod is going to hold experience. And as you do damage, as you destroy enemy units, you're going to take more and more experience. The first 2 are white, the next 2 are yellow, the last one is red. That represents the fluctuation in how well you have to roll to do the damage. So like Ryan said, what does it start with?
So my tank here starts anything under a 7. So I'd have to go through and I could pick out anything that's a 7 or below. So I go through and I say everything that's a 7 or below is a hit. Everything that isn't is not. But if you look at that sheet, if you look at the tiger, it shows you when I get up to the yellow experience, I can save everything that's a 9 or less. When I get up to the final, the red experience, I can save anything that's 11 or less, which is pretty much anything but a 12. But then you look at the number of hits, and I would tell David, I've done 6 hits to you, and then he can look at his chart and see how much damage he actually takes.
Yeah, so I look here, and as he's done 6, I have it saying here, if he's done 5, I'm going to take 3 damage. 7, I've taken 4.
Yeah.
So it's between that. So it goes to the 5. I'm going to take 3 damage. Now, like I said, I'm going to do some damage back, potentially. My infantry, and this is where it reflects sort of the strength of the innate unit.
Sure.
My infantry, I had to hit a 2 or lower. And I only got 2 of those, which means I probably didn't do anything.
It does only 1 damage to the tank. Now, terrain matters a little bit here. Some of the units actually have a benefit if they're in forest versus not. They're a little harder to hit. If they're in the forest, they take a little bit less damage. That doesn't apply to every unit, but just some of the units. And then, like we said, some of the units just can't even be hit. Like certain units can't attack planes and things like that. So positioning where you are really does factor into this. But as you can see, I've done a lot of damage to David, which is the way that you're going to gain that experience. So after every combat, you're going to be adding some of those little beads to these prongs, both in damage and in experience potentially.
Now, there are some other circumstances where you might be able to roll over units very easily. If I have an infantry, mobile or otherwise, in a factory because I've taken it over, and Ryan gets close enough to just move on to that factory, automatically destroys any units in the factory, whether it's the infantry that just took it over, or say I took it over and later in the game I'm using that factory to repair or produce another unit. If that factory is in jeopardy, it's not a great place to actually build a new unit.
Inside the factory, they're vulnerable. They're in progress.
They're gone, and he can just step onto it and take it over. And it's going to automatically destroy the unit that might be on top of it.
Yeah, so this combat process that we kind of just showed you is going to be carried out for every possible fight. When you get to the end of your turn, you've done all your movements and you're going to trigger them in your chosen order. So you're going to look at what you've got in front of you and then decide the order that you're going to resolve these fights. This matters because once you've decided your attack order, you can't change it. So, for example, if I had declared, okay, my tank is going to attack this Jeep and not my infantry is going to go do something else, I can't later change that and say, well, the tank didn't quite destroy it. I want to switch my infantry target and also attack the Jeep. Like, he's already got his target. He's got his orders. They're carrying them out. So it's meant to kind of feel like it's all happening simultaneously, even though you do resolve it like one after another.
Yeah, and it's also important to point out in this example that we showed earlier, that was just the tank attacking the Jeep. Then he's also going to resolve the plane attacking the Jeep, if it can, which I assume it can.
It can attack the ground as well.
And then in that case, we're going to look at his plane's stats, and the tank is only going to contribute that one red die.
Yeah, backed again. So it's important. The positioning, like I said earlier, is incredibly important in this game. That is where the real depth of the strategy comes into. Because situations like this, where David drives his infantry right up to my tank and plane, probably wouldn't happen in a real game, but we thought it would be an interesting example to show you. And then, of course, as you kind of get whittled down, you start taking damage, you're doing less, you're rolling less die. So the idea of like pushing and then pulling back to retreat and repair and then pushing is a crucial part of the flow of the game.
And protecting those infantry units for sure, because those are the only ones that can take over the factories. Now, there's one other thing to point out. This is a prototype, so the units we have here are just the ones we received. The rulebook suggests that you can produce more and more units, so you are going to have a situation where if you've taken over some factories and maybe in a bigger game with 4 players with a lot of push and pull, there's people producing, so you're gonna see a fair amount more units out here. And we mentioned the units are gonna move different distances. Just to underscore that, they move wildly different distances.
The planes, for example.
The planes can move like up to 14 spaces in some cases, where an infantry might just move a couple.
Right, which makes perfect sense to the theme of the game, how those units actually move. And the last thing, if we didn't make this very clear, you're doing all of this in one go. So you're doing all of your movements and your attacks, and then you're done. In a 4-player game, you need to be aware that whatever combat you start, if those units don't move, they're going to start another combat on their turn, and then another player can come in and start another combat on their turn. So you need to be very careful when you're pushing forward. And I think as you play this game, you're going to start to learn that. Even if you're not a wargamer, this could start getting you thinking along those lines.
Sure, and you're only looking at a few units, so when you look at your opponent, you can say, how far can this guy move? Okay, so he can't get into this fight on your turn? All right, then I'll do this. But that is Aces and Armor. If you have any questions at all about it, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.